Topic 2. Peacemaking and the League of Nations. You could get asked a question about the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and there's 4 main terms that they'll be looking for you to know. First of all, let's start off with the military terms. Remember, you always need to explain what they were and how that made Germany weak or why it angered the Germans. So the military terms of the treaty were that Germany were only allowed 100,000 men in their army and no reserve army at all. This would mean that Germany would be militarily weak. This hurt the Germans because they'd always prided themselves on being strong militarily. Also, countries like Poland that bordered them had a really strong army in comparison to this, so they knew that they were in trouble. They were also only allowed 6 battleships. This was only for defence and protection for themselves. They weren't allowed to do anything else or build any more of a navy. They were not allowed any submarines whatsoever, and they weren't allowed an air force. Something else that was also brought in was there was meant to be no conscription at all, which meant that they couldn't expand the army any further than it was. So all of these things made the Germans weak, and they felt they couldn't protect themselves. So this really hurt the Germans, and they felt vulnerable to attack. Another term of the treaty that you could get asked would be about the territorial terms or the land losses. These two are exactly the same thing. So what were the land losses? Well, they lost first of all 1/10 of their own land. This hurt the Germans because the Treaty of Versailles was immediately weakening them. They also lost all the colonies. This is ironic because the reason why they'd gone into the First World War was for an empire, and now they had none. They were also forbidden to unite with Austria because of being with Austria-Hungary in the alliance before the First World War. The Rhineland was demilitarised zone, so although it was still theirs, they weren't allowed to put any troops in there because it bordered France and France was scared of an attack. You can also put that into the military terms if you get a question just about the military. You can mention the Rhineland in both. The Saar region, which had loads of important industry and resources in for the Germans, and where a lot of the money came from, was taken from them for 15 years, and it was looked after by the League of Nations. But really it was being looked after by Britain and France, as were the colonies. This again angered the Germans because they wanted to be stronger than these countries initially, and now those people had more power over them. They also lost the Polish corridor, so that was another piece of land that had gone. Alsace-Lorraine, that they'd taken from France in 1871, was also given back to France. This embarrassed them because they'd always been proud of taking the land in 1871. And finally, an important point was, in 1917, when Russia pulled out of the war, they had to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. They gave them a lot of land so that Germany would stop fighting with them. So all the land that had been taken from Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had to be returned. Another term of the treaty that is extremely important, and usually these two come together, is the War Guilt Clause and reparations. The War Guilt Clause was the clause and the term that the Germans hated the most, because it simply made them accept total responsibility for the First World War. This was unfair because it was Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian terrorist, that actually started the war. But the War Guilt Clause meant the Germans felt embarrassed and humiliated, and by accepting the War Guilt Clause, which was Clause 231, it meant they were accepting all the other terms of the treaty. So, what they had to accept with the War Guilt Clause was not only the territorial and military terms, they also had to accept the reparations. This economically crippled Germany. By the end of the First World War, Germany were economically on their knees. There was no visible way, really, they could pay back what had been the damage that had been done in the First World War. But that's what they were expected to do. So when they signed the treaty in 1919, they were told to pay reparations, but the sum hadn't been set. The sum was set in 1921. It's 6,600 million. The Germans just couldn't see a way that they were going to pay. And this was unfair because there'd been other countries involved in the war as well, but Germany were having to foot the whole bill. If they'd paid it back in the instalments over a number of years that they were expected to, they would have paid it back by 1989. However, Hitler, when he came to power, for 12 years between 1933 and 45, he stopped paying reparations. So what happened? Interest accrued on that, and actually they didn't pay the final sum back. The final instalment was paid back in September of 2010. So nearly a century later, Germans were still paying for the reparations bill that was set down in the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War. This made the Germans mad because they felt that they'd been unjustly treated, and it was unfair that they had to accept all the blame for the war and pay back all of the reparations. You need to know these terms in detail, and you need to understand why it would anger the Germans and how they would feel about it.